Our next report is on transportation, Dr. Maleko, Mr. Tom Wall, and Mr. Mark Andrews.
So part of this report, I'll just mention too, was due to some of the conversation that we had at the last board meeting, and just to kind of get information out there, because transportation kept coming up in the community forums and other areas, and we had some public comment about that, so there has been responses to that, and so we're providing additional information and the ability for board members to ask questions after the presentation.
Good evening.
Good evening.
We're going to start off by giving a little bit of background information. Daily, we transport about 5,000 students to school. And when you combine that with taking them to school or transporting them home after, that's about 10,000 passengers that we transport daily. For the school year, it's about 175,000 passengers, just to give you an idea of what we do in our department. We transport to 18 general ed schools, and we travel about 5,000 miles daily, and about 875,000 annually. Now, if you were to incorporate our field trips that we do, athletic trips, that will push us over 1 million miles a year. Our fleet is composed of all Bluebird transit-style buses with a maximum seating capacity of 78 passengers at 3 to a seat. When you look at efficiency, back in about 2009, it could have been a little bit longer, Plant Moran consulted the district. They gave us suggestions at where we could operate a little bit more efficiently. One of those suggestions was eliminating bus routes by maximizing our seating capacity. Now, we've been using it as a guideline since, and it is a challenge to manage because eligible riders, they can ride any time that they want. They could ride in the morning, afternoon, Tuesdays and Thursdays, any time that they want. So what that does is it creates ridership fluctuations throughout the year. So, and you know, some of the reasons why the students may choose a ride could be weather, it could be family commitments, could be sports. We tend to see historically more students ride in the morning than they do after school. I can contest to that. I used my parents used to drive me to school. I used to catch a ride home from my friends after school. So there's many reasons why it fluctuates. One of the reasons also that I also would like to point out is we have a policy that we don't leave students behind at the bus stops in the morning. And when you get to middle school, especially high school, these students are pretty savvy and they realize that. So they might go use a bus stop that they're not supposed to, knowing that we won't leave them behind. Now, to manage this, the first thing that we do is rely on our drivers to give us feedback along with the schools. And we also, as a department, we do what we call ridership counts. We'll do them for all of our routes at least 5 times a year, but also when we get feedback that we have a rise in specific schools, we'll do counts just for that school. So just recently, we did a count for Etzel Ford during the whole week of December 4th, and we did another one for Stout during the whole week of December 18th. This slide right here, it just kind of gives you a snapshot. The last count we did for all of our routes was back on November 1st. And that's what most of these schools are, but I did update Etzel Ford and Stout. And I'll try to make a little bit of sense of it for you. So looking at Etzel Ford, we have 10 buses that transport to Etzel Ford. So during that week, we averaged 59 students per bus. And we had about 78% of the eligible bus riders use the bus that week. Now, when I say average, we did have a couple days where we had one bus one morning reach 76, and another morning we had a bus reach 68. Okay? And then looking at Stout, we have 11 buses that transport students to Stout. During the week of December 18th, we had an average of 52 riders per bus, and we actually had 92% of the eligible riders ride the bus that week. Now, when we do need to make adjustments, the first thing that we try to do is, let me back up for a minute here. When we do a specific count for a school like we did for Etzel Ford and Stout, we'll do it to where we break down and we'll count how many students use each bus stop. And what that does, it helps me for this first adjustment I'm going to talk about, and that's reassigning bus stops to another bus that might be able to accommodate more students. Now, worst case scenario, and I say this as a last resort, because once we assign a student a bus stop, we like them to use that bus stop for the whole year. However, on a rare last resort, we may take a few students off a bus stop and move them to another bus stop. This is an ongoing process, takes great coordination with the schools and my drivers. It's a process that will continue, and we'll make the appropriate adjustments when needed.
Trustee Petlicoff?
Okay. We know, and my kids were bused way back when to Stout. When you say 3 to a seat, kids at the middle school, high school level are potentially adult size. I know I use the bus to go to the homecoming, and I wouldn't imagine having 3 people of me crammed onto, including a backpack and a gym bag and
Right.
instrument and whatever. So if you're saying you've got a bus coming from, with 76 kids that has a maximum of 78, that's a lot of cramming of mostly adult-sized students onto a vehicle. Add to that the fact that a lot of kids, I don't want to sit next to you, you're not my friend, and you're just trying to get the kids on the bus, get them sit down so you can get moving, and you've got everybody trying to jockey by who they want to be by.
Absolutely.
And not be by, and you don't have any room for them to maneuver. Are we being unrealistic in assuming that, I know it's cost effective? I also know we have a challenge not only of not having the number of buses, but of getting drivers. But in the end, is that the best way to manage the system?
It's a great question, and I'll give you my best professional assessment on that. But I want to back up here and tell you what transportation does. As soon as our driver starts the key of that bus, there is risk involved. So every day, most of what I do and a lot of what our drivers do throughout the day, they're analyzing risk and they're trying to make decisions, whether it be a car cutting them off or me deciding where a bus stop should be. We're analyzing that risk and we're trying to make the best decision that we can. Not eliminating risk, but we're trying to make it the best or the lowest risk possible. So what you said is absolutely correct. If I were to go, which I have, and go sit on a school bus all by myself, it's going to be uncomfortable. But what I would tell you is that school buses, when they were designed by the Federal Motor Carrier and the National Transportation Highway, everything was revolved around safety and not comfort. And part of that is having the kids what's called compartmentalization, and that's, to be honest with you, it's cramming them in there.
Packing them like
Packing them in
sardines.
there, right. So if you were to step on a bus, you will, and after I point this out, you would notice that the way the buses are designed with the cushioned seats, not much room in between the seats, no blunt objects, everything's rounded. That if a bus were to get in an accident, that's what it's designed to do, is not allow them to move around. So, but with that comes a sacrifice of comfort. And one other thing I'd like to point out too is these buses are one of the biggest vehicles on the road, especially around Dearborn. And what I like to point out to people and to try to put it imaginary of a student sitting on a bus, where students' feet are, they were intentionally designed to be above the average height of a hood of a vehicle. That way, if a vehicle were to hit a bus, it's going underneath our students and not into the side of them.
Trustee?
You mentioned that you did ridership counts on a few of the buses. How do you do that? Is that something physically an additional person gets on? Does the bus driver usually do that?
The bus driver will manually count each student that gets on at each bus stop.
Is
And
there
then we-
another system that could be implemented so that the bus driver doesn't necessarily need to do that? I mean, all the students should already have a school-issued ID. Is there some way that they could have to like punch in that way you could have real
Yeah,
time on all the buses?
We tried that, but the challenge with that, and I think some of the high schools can contest, is getting the students on board to have that with them every day. And again, that backs up with our current policy of not leaving them behind in the morning. Like when we have a problem with ridership getting to capacity and sometimes over capacity, it is almost always in the morning because the students know that they can, and I'll be honest, it's not that students aren't always being deceitful. You know, sometimes they'll miss their bus and they know that right around the corner is another bus stop and they'll go over there and get on the bus and go to school. So sometimes it's because they want to ride with their buddies or their friends.
There is
Sometimes
a
the
lot
bus
of
stop
that.
is closer. But the schools are great with working with us. Whenever we get into a questionable area of capacity, the schools are great to work with us, and they'll get on the students that shouldn't be using the stops that they're using.
Thank you.
Mr. Andrews, thank you, because I think these numbers just really tell us something really impressive, which is every day we deliver thousands of kids safely. We get incident reports if there's any kind of incidents, and I must say that we don't get those very often. So it's a testament to all of your staff and
I
our
appreciate
bus
that.
drivers, which I rode a bus, so I know, and I had a relative who was a bus driver. I know how challenging it is because they aren't always on their best behavior. They're pretty keyed up a lot of times, especially on field trips. So
Yeah.
it really is a challenge, and you do it every day, and you do it for our students. So I appreciate that. I'd also like to say that I taught school abroad for a couple of years. So those students and families taught me what a privilege education is. We take it for granted because it's our birthright as Americans, and we expect that we'll have a high-class education, and we do have. And I heard during the community forums a lot of complaining about the buses. I complained many times myself about buses, but we provide that as a district, and as a district, we've always insisted that we have seat belts. So, we've tried to do the best possible with our transportation. I really appreciate that. And I think most parents, although they maybe don't like the busing and the kids don't like standing and waiting, it's a real service. So thank you. I hate to put you on the spot. I understand, because I've been on the buses, I get this stuff, but besides the factors of people on buses, I understand when I started asking a little bit about, well, what buses are going into what high schools, thinking on high school issues. Dr. Maleko said that, well, it's one thing to get buses in. So there's the issue of kids on buses, but there's also the issue of buses in and around our schools. Are there, particularly on the east side, in urban areas, are there issues that we have to think about also when we're talking now about boundary issues?
So you mean having room for the buses to pull
Right,
up?
I mean, I
Yep.
was over at Ford's and I
Yeah,
watched
absolutely.
the buses come in there.
In my opinion,
so
being a
do you
Dearborn
have any
resident-
guidance for all of us on
Well,
that issue?
Being a Dearborn resident and a product of the Dearborn schools, and it's just something that I enjoy, is I like old architecture. But when these schools, most of our schools were built, they weren't built with in mind of buses pulling up to them. Back then, and I think for that matter, most of our teachers walked to school back then.
Probably.
Times have changed over the years, with some of our buildings being 80, I think even some are 100 years old. So,
Salina going on 100.
yeah.
Yeah.
So to answer
year.
your question, I would say our newer schools like McCullough Eunice, and some of them that have been updated, could handle our buses pulling up. But most of our schools, you're absolutely right, we would have to change the infrastructure around the schools in order for them to be able to have the room to safely. And I say safely, you can make something happen, but to safely do something and doing it right, we would have to change a lot of the infrastructure at a lot of our schools.
And just can I comment too, relative to that, because that came up with, when we talked at Salina Community Forum of whether they were favorable to going to Fordson, but we'd also have to work through the logistics if we did, and that you're going to see some feedback from that. I was at that forum when you guys had a college board meeting that night. I went. But there, we had talked about that, and not to say it's impossible, but it would be
Right.
very difficult, given right now you have special ed transportation.
Right. I came from the building industry, so telling me something's impossible is not in my scope of thinking. Anything is possible, it's just a matter of how much money you want to spend and what you would like to do.
Or how much time.
Or how much
I
time,
know I've
absolutely.
watched, my niece was coming on a bus over into Fordson, and the gridlock over there was,
Fortune is one of the worst. When we have, right now, we have one special ed bus, and we have three, we call shuttle buses that go over the Berry Center.
right.
And just with that alone, it's gridlock over there. We
Right.
have to allow extra time for those
Yeah.
buses to get in and out.
Yeah. So I guess I'm just trying to bring up, are there any other, so Fordson probably is our biggest,
If you're looking at the high
Consideration on
schools,
that.
I would rank Fortson as the worst, Dearborn High in the middle, and that's what Ford has the best for putting more buses at.
Mr. Berry?
Yes, I also echo trustee Lane's remarks. I'm on the road all day long, and I see our buses throughout the city. Yes, very safe, good drivers. Sometimes, students are well behaved on the bus, so this was never anybody questioning your department. Thank you for what you do every day.
You're welcome.
But during one of the community forums, a student showed up. I was there, and I believe there was a few of us there, and she brought a lot of things to our attention. This is a student it's on a bus for the last few years, every day. Going back to Trustee Petrikov's comments, let's forget the high number, 70. Let's go with our average, 59. Even with the average 59, there's some seats with 3 students on there, high school students on there. So, and that's what she was troubled with. She says, I'm
Right.
sitting there, people are touching me, it's 6:30 in the morning. It was a little bit more than just uncomfortable. She also mentioned, she went as far as saying there was sometimes there's 4 students to a seat.
Yeah, I wouldn't tell you that's never happened, but if it does, it's rarely. And when it does,
Yeah.
we get on it right away and try to
Sure,
remedy it.
Sure, and it sounds like
I would go back, to answer your question, I would go back again to saying that I can understand students as far as being uncomfortable and being tight. But that's what the buses are designed to be like. For example, our buses are 78 passengers. You can buy smaller buses, 54 seats, 64 seats. If you were to even go to a 54 seat, it's going to be the same parameters because those are the specifications that the Highway Traffic and Safety and the Federal Motor Carrier, those are the specifications that they've given, the manufacturers to build the buses at, because as of right now, there's some talk in legislation, but as of right now, it is not law federally and in Michigan, and I should say in most states. There are a couple states across the nation that have mandated seatbelts. So with that being in mind, the buses are designed to keep the students safe with no seatbelts being used.
I got a follow-up question, going back to eligible riders, and I think not the last meeting, the meeting before, it was mentioned that, we don't know how many students can jump on the bus. They just show up to the bus stop and they're there. What is our safety measure there so that the right person get on the bus? I mean, obviously, we're not checking, we don't have the time to check 78 or 77 IDs, but, how do you control something like that? That's scary.
You're absolutely
That is
right.
scary.
It's challenging. It's
Very
challenging. But when that happens, there's been occasions where the school, somebody from my department, myself, we've gone out to bus stops in the morning and we've checked IDs at the
Okay.
bus stop in the morning. It doesn't happen a lot, but in worst case scenarios like you're mentioning, that's one of the that's one of the, our tools that we can do to try to help stop that.
Okay, thank you.
My son rides the bus, and for the first couple weeks of school, the bus driver made sure she knew all the kids' names and knew which kids were getting on at the right and wrong bus stops too. So the bus drivers do know the students.
That's at the elementary level.
Yeah, he's in.
Yeah, I mean, those are probably better controlled.
Well, I wouldn't say, elementary students are a little bit more open. They're a little
Yeah.
bit more open to getting to know the driver and telling their name.
Sure.
For high school students, they tend to be a little more quiet, just want to be with their friends. If you ask for their name, a lot of times they don't want to tell you. So, that's one of the
They're
differences.
quiet
But-
because they're half asleep in the morning.
But we encourage our drivers to get to know all the students' names.
Yes, sir. Trustee Thorpe?
At the community forums, it was also mentioned multiple times about activity buses.
Okay.
So what are we doing and how can we make sure that there is buses for when the activities let out? Is there coordination between the transportation department and each of the buildings to know what time all activities should be done so that we know?
Right, we leave it up to the school to dictate to us what, I mean, when we try to meet what the request the best we can, there's sometimes we can't because our buses are still on the road taking students home for the day. So outside of that, we try to accommodate what the school needs, and we leave it up to them to request what their needs are.
Can I make a comment on that too? There was some data that Mr. Andrews provided, it was a few months ago, on, we have some activity buses, for example, at the high school specific with Etzel, we have 2 and then we have 1 later. We have 2, I believe, at Dearborn, and then we're exploring or is it 1? We have them at Dearborn the earlier, we're exploring the option of hopefully employing a later for Dearborn High. That would then maybe resolve some of those issues. We did that at Etzel. Now, again, you've also mentioned that a lot of times, and you talk to the principals, they're not highly used, but we're providing that service and we can monitor and see. But again, it is kind of relative to the unique circumstances of those high schools. So Etzel, it was very helpful when we added the later bus. So we're going to give consideration to, that for the later.
And there was people that were talking from this line of community about the ability to be involved with activities over at Etzel because they don't have transportation, or that they don't view it as having full transportation. So just making sure that the kids can get across town when they need to, and we don't have to necessarily hear the stories of 5 of them jumping in a car with a coach so that they could get them to an activity.
Yeah, and I think with Etzel, I talked to the principal, adding that extra, the later bus, I think has been extremely helpful. I can't say that for every single athletic group because there's unique circumstances around what the time is when they're playing.
Right.
But the second bus that was added has definitely helped that situation at Etzel Ford. And that's the feedback I've gotten when I've gone to different community meetings. They're not the community forum around the boundaries, but I meet with that group over at Saline every couple of months, so.
Second bus at a later time?
Yes. Yeah, it's, what is it?
We currently have, so when we do an activity bus, we add stops in all the areas that we provide transportation for, but they're more generalized. So the bus stops will cover a greater area than they would for their normal stops to school and after the school. So at Etzel Ford, we have 2 buses. We split up the area and do 2 buses at 4:15, and then we have another bus at 6 o'clock that does all the bus area. So when the students get on the bus at 6 o'clock, the driver asks the students, we rely on the students and high school students, I feel comfortable with that. What stop do you need to go to? And those are the only stops that the bus will drop off for that particular afternoon.
So we would explore that second option for Dearborn High.
Right, at
and just
Dearborn,
see if it would be
Dearborn High,
helpful
we
or not.
currently have 1 bus at 4:15. And like Dr. Maleko mentioned, we're exploring the later bus.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Tom, Mr.
Yep,
Wall?
I just want to say thank you for giving Mark the time. You can tell he's very knowledgeable.
Yep.
When you talk about transportation, safety is always the number 1 priority. We do pre-bus inspections before they go out, post when they come back. The schedules change constantly, so you can see he's very knowledgeable about what happens. A lot of kudos to Mark, his office staff and drivers. No day's ever the same in transportation. It's always changing every single day. So I give a lot of credit to him to make sure our kids are safe and get home safely.
And I just want to thank him too for presenting, and he's part of our boundary capacity because he has a lot of those polyplots and other things in the data. And when you talk about safety, some of you might remember 2 years ago, we had a bus that got caught on fire, and it was the work of the driver that made sure, and they practiced safety drills, that we didn't have anyone harmed whatsoever from this fire that occurred on the bus. So again, and I remember they were commended by EMS and others that came and said that the bus driver took immediate action. So there's just another example of safety number 1. So thank you, Mr. Andrews. You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next item, please.
Next item, action items. I believe 7 needs a roll call vote, so. Other than item number 7, are there any agenda items on this agenda which board members or the superintendent wish to discuss and vote on separately? If there are, we will exclude these from the motion below.
Hearing none.
Okay, so recommended action, move that action items 1 through 9 be approved as recommended in this agenda with the exception of 7.
Support.
Second.
Or is that to move?
No, move.
Yeah, I wondered about that. I
Supported,
thought
and
maybe
Jim
I was
Thorpe
the only one.
supported.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Ayes have it, unanimous.
I'm going to read the summary of agenda items. Number 1, approval of warrants.
Do we have to do 7, or do
We'll
we
come
do
back
it
to
later?
7.
We
Yeah,
come
we'll
back?
to 7,
Okay.
yeah. Approval of warrants. Number 2, approval of an award to Benchmark Publishing. Number 3 through 5, approval of non-instructional and instructional personnel items for P through 12. Number 6, approval of financial statement. Skipping to number 8 is approval of resolution to oppose Senate Bills 584-586 and Senate Bill 366. And number 9, approval of donations. Going back to number 7, approval of P through 12 special meeting time change. Did you want to comment on that?
Sure,
or-
I can comment. So we approved this meeting for 4 o'clock a couple of months ago. I believe it was either October or November. And this is really being dictated by the Advanced Ed National Organization. They understand that all trustees may not be able to make it. It happens once every 5 years. Ms. Fatmi Faraj is leading that. There was a memo that was sent to the board regarding this. It's something that's required, and what they do is they actually come in on Sunday. I meet with them and some of my, I believe, my cabinet members on Sunday night. And then there's going to be some meetings that are going to be set up with some board members that may. But they also understand, and so it's not a pressure because as we talk about the lives that you have, that's maybe a tough time. But anybody that could make it, it would be appreciated. But if you can't, it's understandable. The Advanced Ed group that gives us our national accreditation every 5 years, which is aligned to the whole school improvement process that we've been using. And so Ms. Faraj had gotten word that they had requested, because of their flights leaving that night, that they couldn't make the 4 o'clock work. They said it'd be 3. They said it would roughly be about 30 minutes to 45 minutes for a report out. We kind of gave an hour. So again, any trustees that can participate in those activities, I think Joanne set out some information on maybe getting some people to meet with them on Monday. They were also flexible with that. If people couldn't meet on Monday, that they would be willing to take phone interviews after. I don't know, Trustee Lane, if you may have been involved, or Trustee Petlicoff when they came the last time, or Trustee Berry, I can't remember if. But anyway, it's something that's required for accreditation, so that's kind of why the change is being made.
Okay, thank you. For number 7, the recommended action is move that the time of the special meeting on Wednesday, February 14th, 2018 be moved from 4 p.m. to 3 p.m.
So moved.
Support.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed, unanimous, ayes.